And as you say, you set up the FSU in early 2020, and I think it was February, wasn't it? And then 2 months later, Lockdown Skeptics, as it was then now, the Daily Skeptic. Did you envisage when you started the FSU that it would end up dealing with aspects of the pandemic quite so directly, or was it, you mentioned it was fortuitous? Did you see there was an intersection between the two when you started them, or was it something that
Um, no, and they're not. Well, they're not. They're not formally linked in any way,
no?
save for the fact that I'm the Secretary General of the sorry, no, General Secretary of the Free Speech Union and Editor in Chief of what is now the Daily Skeptic. I mean, I suppose both are rooted in a concern for our freedoms and wanting to defend dissenters, mavericks, people who challenge the status quo. But we have been quite careful at the Free Speech Union not to take sides on the lockdown issue, the mask issue, the vaccines. We don't want people who are pro lockdown, pro mask mandates, pro vaccine to think that we won't defend their free speech at the Free Speech Union if they get into trouble for challenging something else. So we've been quite careful. I think that the Free Speech Union describes itself as a non-partisan organisation, and that means on a whole variety of issues, particularly left-right political issues, we try to remain scrupulously neutral. We're not about defending particular points of view. We're about defending people's right to express their point of view, and sometimes it's quite difficult to get it into people's head. That distinction. People think that if you're defending someone who expresses an anti-BLM point of view and who's suffered for it, that you are therefore anti-BLM. We're not, and we've tried to remain neutral on that issue as far as possible too. We just defend people's right to express their point of view, provided it's within the law and not suffer for it. Lockdown Skeptics is different. The Daily Skeptic, insofar as it does have a much, it takes a position on the various restrictions on our civil liberties that have happened over the past 20 months, and we're pretty vehemently opposed to them. I'm pretty vehemently opposed to them. I'm a kind of staunch defender of our civil liberties. But beyond that, I don't think there's we try to maintain a kind of a sort of Berlin Wall separating the two. The surprising thing about Lockdown Skeptics and now the Daily Skeptic is how popular it's proved to be. The Free Speech Union's proved to be quite popular. We've got now 8,750 members or thereabouts, 12 employees. We get about 50 cries for help a week, and we end up helping about 25 of those people. We also campaign, organise events, publish briefing documents. Just published one telling people what to do if they're told that they have to do unconscious bias training or anti-racism training in their workplace. What can they do to push back if they want to push back? But the Daily Skeptic has been really very popular, exceeding all my initial expectations. In October, it was recently reported on the Guido Fawkes website that we had 2.87 million views. That is 2.87 million visitors to the website, which is more than the New Statesman, Novara Media, and the Morning Star combined, and only just a little bit behind the Spectator. And it's not a one-man band, but it's close to it. It's now created a company, and it has 5 employees, including myself. But for the best part of a year, it was pretty much a one-man band. I think the reason it's attracted so much traffic is because a lot of the views that we publish on the Daily Skeptic just don't find their way into the mainstream media. We've pivoted away slightly from just being just expressing skepticism about lockdowns. We're now expressing skepticism about other public policies supposedly informed by the science, particularly scientific models like the climate change agenda, and we're moving into other areas. But that all of those kind of points of view dissenting from those dominant narratives. We call it the unholy trinity, Matt. So there's the kind of which collectively make it very difficult to speak freely. So it's the kind of wokery, the kind of out of control wokery, particularly in universities, museums, galleries, across the public sector, charities. It's the dominant COVID narrative, and it's the sort of climate change agenda. We call those three areas the unholy trinity, and together they have made it that I think they're responsible for a lot of attacks on free speech and a lot of suppression of dissenting points of view. It's a sort of someone else described those three things as a form of nice totalitarianism, under the pretext of protecting the most vulnerable, whether it's historically disadvantaged groups, the people vulnerable to the virus, the people who are going to suffer in the global south as a result of the climate emergency, under the guise of protecting, the weak, the poor, and the vulnerable. Lots of very rich and powerful people have made it their business to promote a fairly totalitarian agenda, and that totalitarianism comes out in their intolerance for any dissent. These things they don't consider up for discussion. And if you challenge any of the kind of fundamental precepts in any of those three areas, you're likely to find yourself targeted for cancellation. The Daily Sceptic, I hope, will for as long as it can, continue to challenge the kind of prevailing orthodoxies in all three areas. And we challenge them in what I hope is a fairly reasonable, evidence-based way. So we're not anti-science, and we're not conspiracy theorists. We're not even anti-vaxxers, but we just rigorously scrutinise claims that people make, which purport to be rooted in science and evidence, but on closer inspection turn out to be pretty flimsy.
I was going to say there again back to the fine line argument. Each of those three things, wokery, I suppose one can include general equality, climate change. I think we've all got a desire not to destroy the planet through pollution, and the lockdown measures. If one takes it as to protect as many lives as possible, it would be very easy to sit here and argue all three of those are incredibly worthy principles, things to aspire to, and one should be supporting them. Where does it move from a worthy cause to something a little more sinister where you might get involved?
Well, one of the things we've been challenging on the Daily Sceptic with increasing regularity is the net zero policy, whereby the UK wants to move to zero carbon emissions, I think, by 2050, and that will involve forcing people to replace their gas boilers, forcing people to give up diesel or petrol-driven cars, take fewer holidays, and so on and so forth. It's not. We don't think. I mean, if you look at the science behind that policy, the thing which really jumps out, if you look at it in any detail, is that it's far from settled. Over the last 25 years, average global temperatures haven't really increased very much, which suggests that the global warming hypothesis may be overstated. Antarctica, for instance, has just recorded its lowest temperatures over a 6-month period since records began. Again, calling into question some of the more alarmist claims of the climate emergency activists, and many of their anxieties, many of their claims, which is that if we don't immediately start reducing our carbon emissions, the world is essentially going to catch fire, seem to be rooted in models produced by climate change scientists. And I think one of the things we've learnt over the past 20 months is that computer models are very poor predictors of the future. We've seen people like Neil Ferguson proved wrong again and again over the past 20 months. Other modelling teams, public health modelling teams, proved wrong. They nearly always are in the kind of more apocalyptic direction. They never underestimate the likely effects of things like COVID-19. They always wildly overestimate them, and you get the impression, looking at some of these climate change models, that they too are overestimating the likely impact of human activity on global warming. That's just one area in which I think we would challenge some of the more outlandish apocalyptic predictions made by climate change activists. When it comes to wokery, I think one area where the Free Speech Union's been very active has been in defending old-fashioned traditional feminists who don't sign up to the trans rights activists' agenda. People like Kathleen Stock, until recently professor of philosophy at Sussex University, who's essentially been hounded out of her job, hounded off campus by trans rights activists because she defends sex-based women's rights. She doesn't think that that every right currently enjoyed by women should also be enjoyed by trans women. So, she questions whether trans women should be placed in women's prisons, should have access to women's changing rooms, women's refuges, should be able to compete against women in women's sports. Not you would have thought particularly unreasonable positions to take, and I think positions that the majority of the British public would agree with. But on campus, at least on some campuses, claiming you don't think that trans women are completely indistinguishable from women and should be treated like women in every conceivable respect, including legally. That point of view is heresy. And if you express that point of view, you are likely to, at the very least, see very aggressive protests erupting on campus. And at worst, you're likely to get death threats. You're unlikely to get much support from the university authorities. Kathleen Stock for many years got very little support. More recently, she did get some support, but by then it was too little, too late. But we've at the Free Speech Union come to the aid of a number of women who've found themselves at the wrong end of a trans Twitchfork mob and who've suffered for it. I mean, just one example, we've been trying to look after an author called Gillian Phillip, who was fired by her publisher, and they cancelled a 2-book deal, I think, because all she did was express support for J.K. Rowling. She tweeted her support for J.K. Rowling. Some junior members of staff, woke members of staff at her publishing company objected, and she was immediately fired. No due process, just tossed to the wolves. And you see that kind of thing happening all over the place. I mean, it's particularly bad in publishing, in the performing arts, in the theatre world, but it's bad in charities as well, bad at universities. You see a huge amount of intolerance. It's as though this point of view associated with a tiny, tiny minority, and which is quite extremist, and which has been vigorously promoted by organisations like Stonewall, but which isn't widely shared by the public, has somehow become the orthodoxy across all these institutions, and any dissent from that orthodoxy risks getting you cancelled.
As you just pointed out, the majority of British public would perhaps agree with many of the things you just said. So why is it that such a powerful voice can be brought to bear against dissenters, against that orthodoxy? How do you think that's come about?
I think I think social media has played a large part in that. I think that one of the things that woke activists are very good at is using social media, particularly Twitter, to amplify their voices. Um, uh, Twitter, to begin with, is not representative of the UK public. We know from various surveys that people who are active on Twitter tend to be left of centre, and many of them quite hard left. And I think that they're quite good at organising in a kind of loose, unstructured way groups of activists to pile onto dissenters. And sometimes, that there's a bit of pushback from the other side, and sometimes the Free Speech Union helps people push back. But institutions, university vice chancellors, people running charities, members of the boards, they look at the pylons on Twitter and think, oh gosh, this must be representative of public opinion. This is going to damage our brand. And for institutions that are, dependent on the custom of young people, or charitable donations, or the patronage of large, powerful funding bodies, they're extremely sensitive to any criticism at all. So their immediate reaction is, let's just make this stop. And the easiest way to make it stop is by punishing the person who's provoked the activists in this way. I mean, I think people are becoming less naive about these outrage mobs forming up on Twitter and calling for people's livelihoods to be destroyed. I think people are becoming slightly more sophisticated in understanding that there's an attempt being made to play them in some way. And I think it's perhaps, gradually becoming a less effective tactic, and the other side is kind of getting better at pushing back. And organisations like the Free Speech Union, I think, have been playing their part in all of that. But I think that has been the kind of root of the problem up to now. That's been how small minorities of people with quite extremist points of view, completely out of step with the public, have been able to make themselves the dominant voices, and they terrify people from dissenting by meting out these kind of punishment beatings to anyone who does dissent. If you publicly challenge them, the likelihood is you'll be kind of screamed at in this really unpleasant way on social media. If you challenge the trans rights agenda, you'll be labelled a transphobe. If you challenge BLM, you'll be labelled a racist. If you challenge climate change alarmism, you'll be labelled a denier. And you have to be pretty thick-skinned to withstand that kind of smear. It's unpleasant. Lots of people believe it, including your employers. So because they behave in this kind of brutal, kind of mob-like way, it's quite effective at suppressing dissent. And I think one of the reasons people are disinclined to dissent is because they don't realise that they're in the majority. One of the ways in which these small minorities of kind of woke activists have sort of exercised such power is by punishing people who challenge them. They've created the impression that they're much more numerous and there's much less dissent to their points of view than there really is. I think once people begin to realise that the woke are in a tiny minority, and not many people actually share their agenda, then you'll begin to kind of see their power diminish. I mean, we saw it. Elections, I think, are very helpful. Jury trials are very helpful. Secret ballots are very helpful because they give people an opportunity in secret to say what they really think without risk of being punished for saying it. And when they're given that opportunity, an overwhelming majority of people turn out to be not very sympathetic to any of these causes.
I suppose all too often that opportunity is not given. We do see real-term effects of these Twitter pylons. We do see people losing their jobs. We do see people being humiliated and mocked. Is there any way that could be stopped or at least tempered?
Well, The government is preparing something called the Online Safety Bill. So that's currently in the parliamentary sausage machine, and it looks like it'll become an act of parliament sometime next year. And there are various measures in that bill to try and make it harder for people to troll each other on Twitter. It's going to, I think, make it slightly harder for mobs to pile onto people. At least that's the idea. But I think there are some aspects of the online safety bill that are probably worth considering seriously. Some aspects I think will have a chilling effect on free speech. And the Free Speech Union is looking very carefully at that bill at the moment and deciding which aspects of it we think are okay and which aspects we think need improving if the bill isn't going to have a really chilling effect on free speech. One thing that could be done, one thing that the Free Speech Union is campaigning for, Matt, is to make it unlawful under employment law for employers to investigate complaints about things people have said more than 5 years ago. So we see this at the moment with the Yorkshire county cricket scandals. So various cricketers accused of having said offensive or racist things more than 10 years ago are currently under investigation by an independent panel appointed by Yorkshire. I think that if you do allow people to make complaints based on things people have said more than 5 years ago, then it's very difficult for those people to prove their innocence. It comes down to, as often it comes down to, one person's word against another. And these aren't jury trials. These aren't criminal offences. So the mere existence of reasonable doubt is not enough to acquit someone from one of these accusations. The independent panels have to assess them on the balance of probability, and often they're inclined to believe the people making the accusations, because who doesn't want? They don't want to be cast as people who are who don't trust, who don't believe, people making these allegations, particularly if they belong to, historically disadvantaged groups, ethnic minorities, etc. So I think the way to try and put a stop to this endless offence archaeology is to say, look, companies just cannot investigate people for offences unless they're criminal offences. That's different. But if they can't be investigated and punished for saying something lawful more than 5 years ago, because it's just too murky and the chances of innocent people being punished are too great. I think that would be one thing which would improve matters. Another would be to say that companies can't punish people for saying things in a purely private capacity. So one of the things we come across again and again at the Free Speech Union is companies putting people through quite lengthy investigations, and sometimes finding against them for things they've said in a purely private capacity, not in their capacity as employees, not during office hours, not in the workplace, but on Facebook or Twitter, often under a pseudonym. The companies say, well, if someone can link you to us, it doesn't matter if you thought you were saying this in a purely private capacity. It impacts on our reputation, and therefore it's our business, and we can punish you for saying it. I think that's wrong. One example amongst hundreds, but the Free Speech Union is currently representing a guy called Jeremy Sleeth, who was a conductor for the West Midlands trains for I think more than 20 years. And on July 19th, when Freedom Day was announced and the COVID restrictions were lifted, he tweeted, "Thank God the pubs are reopening. He posted on his private Facebook account, "Thank God the pubs are reopening. I didn't want to live in an alcohol-free caliphate for the rest of my life." And one of his co-workers complained, claiming that comment was Islamophobic, and he was dismissed from his job for gross misconduct. He reached out to us for help. We helped him raise some money via a crowdfunder, put together a good legal team for him, and he took his employer to the employment tribunal, and we're awaiting the verdict in that case. But he never should have been investigated, let alone punished, for saying something, well, first of all, extremely mild. I don't think by any stretch that was Islamophobic. But secondly, saying it in a purely private capacity. He didn't say it to his co-worker in the workplace on a train. He said it on Facebook after office hours. And I think if people are, we have to kind of, I think, have a much harder line between our public lives and our private lives. And one of the unfortunate consequences of the growth of social media has seen the erosion of that line and people being punished for things that they've said in a purely private capacity, which I think is wrong.